Hi guys, good to be here. Yeah, still basking, I guess. Well, we're about a month now on, aren't we, from the big night? I think that's acceptable. I think a month is fair. Maybe 2 or 3 months, and maybe time to sort of move on. But I think
Hmm.
I think a month is good.
If we win the
Tom,
Super Cup, how long are we allowed for that?
we've waited 17 years for this. You know what I mean? We can bask in it probably for the next 17 years. We're still living off 84.
I think until Arsenal
Yeah.
win a trophy, we can bask in it, can't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I think that's fair. Yeah, that's Super Cup. I don't know. I mean, you beat PSG in a Super Cup final. I think that's yeah, that's at least a month or two, I reckon, isn't it, into the season? That gets you through a tough start in the Premier League. I reckon you can still keep going through that.
I think so. And to beat the European champions would be something very special. But Tom, Frank is here now. The transfer window is up and running. How are you feeling about Tottenham's window? Do you think it'd be a busy one?
I think it will be quite busy. Yeah, I think there will be. I think generally we think the Premier League is going to be pretty active this summer. I mean, it doesn't feel like it now. I think we're in a bit of a lull because there was a sort of the pre-window, wasn't there, where I think clubs sort of were looking to kind of get a few deals done early if they could. We've seen City obviously do a few things. Generally, the teams who can afford maybe to overpay slightly to kind of get things done early, I think, were pretty active in that little window. But now I feel like clubs are sort of waiting really because the PSR deadline at the end of June. I think the clubs that can are probably now going to wait to sort of get slightly better deals and to negotiate and to kind of have a look at the market. So that's probably what we're seeing now, a little bit of a lull. But I think Spurs will be pretty active. Yeah, I mean, usually when you have a new manager, you always have a little bit of fresh impetus there, where the manager likes some people, doesn't like others, and I think that will mean that there's a very much a clean slate for the squad. Generally, I think we could see some, wouldn't say surprises, but I think some players who maybe Postecoglou didn't fancy maybe coming back into the reckoning. And equally, I'm sure Frank will look at some players and think there's an opportunity there for us to make some funds and to free up some money to bring players in. So I think they'll be busy. I would imagine sort of 4 or 5 players, possibly 6 players. But I mean, you look in that kind of bracket and you're thinking, well, there might be 2 or 3 there who kind of, go into the lineup straight away. And then you're looking maybe 2 or 3 possible youngsters, players who kind of bolster the depth, So within that kind of bracket of 5 or 6 players, you're not talking about half a new team. You're sort of, bolstering the squad, which I think we'd all agree Tottenham really need to do because that was obviously a huge problem last season. And it's going to be even more a problem this season with the Champions League.
In terms of priorities for this window, where do you get a sense of where Tottenham's priorities are going into this window?
I think in the forward line, I think it's where the kind of the club think that they need to do some sort of significant business. I think particularly if you think about the possible future of Son. But I actually think even regardless of that, they've been looking at this position now for a couple of windows at least, I'd say, where they kind of have had their eye on sort of a premium winger, someone who can make a difference. And guys, I mean, I think you look at the best players in the world now. You look at the best teams in the world, and so often it's the difference makers now, isn't it? In football, tend to be those players who play sort of right or left wing, the kind of inverted wingers coming in. You look at obviously Salah, but even players like Doué, Lamine Yamal, Rafinha. They're sort of almost the most expensive players in the world. If you look at the top 10 players in the world now, you'd probably find 5 or 6 of them are kind of out and out winger forwards rather than centre forwards. And I think Spurs have been pretty gifted in that position with Sonny for so long. But obviously, we all know that era is coming to an end, fairly soon, if not pretty shortly. So they've been looking, in that kind of succession planning for a while. But obviously, a club like Spurs, rightly or wrongly, are not prepared just to sort of throw 70, 80 million around, spontaneously, let's say. So they've been planning, they've been looking, they've been sort of weighing up what the best decision is. And I think that is probably a position they will try finally to sort of find an answer to this window in that kind of left wing position. Other than that, I think the central midfield, I think, is a position they need to find a sort of a solution for, particularly in that kind of number 6 role, where I think they've got players who can play there, but I think they haven't really found a real sort of perfect answer, have they? In that kind of pivot position, and it's obviously a very hard role to play. Everyone kind of wants everything now. They want the kind of destroyer who can also, play a perfect pass and can build, and everyone wants a Rodri basically,
Yeah,
and they're hard to
essentially.
find, right?
Yeah, tell me about it. I've been searching the data and the stats and the facts for a number 6 that's going to fill the Rodri void of what we've been looking for ages, and I'm still looking for that player.
Have you
But
found one or
no,
not?
no, no. I think the data suggests that Lucien Agume from Sevilla looking like a good one, but he's still a
Oh yeah.
fairly young player, but hasn't reached the heights of a Rodri yet. It's safe to say that.
How much would it take to get Rodri out of City, you reckon?
Yeah.
You maybe need another significant Rodri injury next season, then there might be a chance, or 2 or 3 at least, but not at the moment. But it's hard, isn't it? I mean, you look at those kind of proven players, and you look at Arsenal, for example, looking at Zubimendi, and it's going to cost them a lot of money, and even he is the kind of the backup to Rodri for Spain, and so you're trying to sort of find. Probably at the moment, look at City, aside Rangers, for example, those kind of out and out central midfielders who can do a bit of everything. They're either very expensive, or you're going to go for a sort of younger player who's got potential, and then it's you're going back down that route of sort of buying players who are unproven. So it's a really difficult position to find, but I think it is a really important position for Spurs, because I don't think Bentancur is really a natural sort of number 6. I think he's much better off as a sort of normal number 8, where he's a bit more freedom to kind of play make and carry the ball forward. Bissouma, similarly, I think the best of Bissouma could perhaps be that player, but I just think we haven't seen that at Spurs. We haven't seen Bissouma kind of play consistently week in, week out, and it's a big question mark for Frank, isn't it, whether or not he basically thinks he can get the best out of Bissouma consistently enough for him to be a sort of top line central midfielder for a club like Spurs, or whether they think he's someone they could move on. And then I think Bergvall as well. I think he's someone where he's got the ability and the talent to be a sort of a number 6, but in a way you would lose a little bit of his creativity by doing that. So they have players who can do the role, but I think they haven't got someone who's perfect for it yet.
A name that's on the market this summer, João Palhinha of Bayern Munich, obviously did very well for Fulham in the Premier League. I've seen links that he potentially could be going back there. Do you reckon that could be an option that Spurs could target this summer?
I think he'd be a great signing, in my opinion. I think he'd be, you kind of have these types of signings in the market where they're sort of opportunity signings. They come up because someone's out of contract or they're unhappy where they are. And, I look at Palhinha, I remember watching him for Fulham, and he's so powerful and such a big presence in midfield. And I think I always remember he sort of, would be very high up the stats for sort of interceptions and reading the game. Okay, maybe not the most sort of incisive, kind of creative, probably like pivot player, but I think in terms of his sort of a defensive ability and the ability to kind of disrupt and intercept attacks, I think he'd be a super buy. But whether or not Spurs could beat other teams who would be interested in terms of his wages as well, but we know that Bayern and Spurs have a pretty good relationship for the last 2 or 3 years. Bayern's sort of hierarchy are not among those who see Daniel Levy as unworkable in terms of deals. They've done it, and they think that he is good to deal with. So if Spurs are interested, then maybe it's one that could happen. But I would imagine it would be one that maybe would happen later in the window. These kind of opportunity signings tend to happen where the player has kind of surveyed various options, and where the club has as well, and then they come to a deal a bit later in the window, perhaps.
It's interesting you were talking about the forward line earlier. You're suggesting that potentially Tottenham are going to favour looking for a left winger rather than a right winger. There's a bit of a debate what we would rather prefer in the fan base. Obviously, we just signed Tell, who was obviously predominantly playing off the left, like a left forward. We obviously have Johnson, who scored 18 goals last season, who's been starting right wing. But other than him, we don't really have maybe a natural right winger maybe to compete with him, whereas right now we kind of have Son. Do you think Tottenham are looking to prioritise a left winger addition rather than a right wing, you think?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I guess sometimes you have versatility in that front three, and that can be a really important thing nowadays. You want players who can do a bit of both, particularly not necessarily from left to right, because that's unusual, but to have a winger who can play down the centre forward position. Perhaps that would then possibly allow them to sell Richarlison, for example, if they thought that someone like Tell could do that job more consistently. I personally wasn't that convinced by him playing there last season. But equally, we've seen Kulusevski play there as well under Ange, and so that versatility can help. I think they've got options on the right with Johnson, obviously, haven't they, and also Kulusevski being able to play there. Odegaard, for example, as well, who we obviously had an injury interrupted season. I think that position on the left is really crucial, to be honest. Coming in off the left behind, if it's not going to be Sonny, and I think even if Son stays, you've got to think that probably in an ideal world they'll have someone there who will at least very much challenge him for that position, and perhaps you have a situation where Son doesn't play as many games as he did last season. So yeah, I think the left. I guess equally with Mbeumo, we know that. If we know Spurs have an interest there, but when he was playing for Brentford, was more comfortable off the right. So I think it's a fluid situation, but I personally think that they're prioritising that left position slightly more than the right. Yeah.
Other players that have been heavily linked to Spurs in the press have been Mbeumo, like you said, Semenyo, Eze, Kudus. Do you reckon any of those could be a likely scenario for Spurs this summer?
It depends on the price, doesn't it? I think they do have an interest in Semenyo, and they've had it for a while. But equally, I think there are a few clubs who have been interested in Semenyo, and Bournemouth aren't going to sell these players for cheap. They've already sold Howson, of course. Kirkez is on his way to Liverpool. Eventually, the need for them to sell is much less. And I guess, in a way, perhaps it's why clubs are going early with those sort of Bournemouth targets. Howson had a release clause, so it's slightly different. But I think as the window goes on, Bournemouth don't need to sell these players, and they're not going to sell, Semenyo for cheap. And when you look at it, do Spurs want to spend 60, 70 million on Semenyo? Maybe, but I think they would probably want a bit more of a sure thing in terms of that. So I think there is an interest there, but I think the gap in terms of the valuation at the moment is probably quite wide. But that doesn't mean it can't close later in the window. Or the other ones you mentioned, Kudus, I think is similar. West Ham again, wanting a lot of money. They've got a release clause for Premier League clubs, which I think is about 80 million. Is that right?
85 million, I think it is.
80, which is a lot, right, for Kudus. So you'd think, Spurs were going to spend 80 million on someone to play out wide. I wonder if they would spend that money on Kudus, who I think is a great player, and also, he's got that ability to not only kind of link up with strikers and score goals, but he's a really good carrier of the ball. And I think if you look at, for example, like someone like Kulusevski, like why he's so valuable for Spurs, these players, they give you an ability to kind of do transitions. You can break presses by having players like Kudus and Kulusevski who can carry it up the field, have the strength to sort of hold players off. So no doubt he's a good player, but they're expensive, and that's the thing with Spurs, they're not really prepared to pay these big fees, 70, 80 million. We saw what Levy and Vinay said the other day about wanting to sort of win the Premier League, win the Champions League. But to do that, to compete with those clubs, you've got to be ruthless in the market. I look at someone like Mbeumo, for example. I think if Man City or Liverpool really wanted Mbeumo, for example, I think they just would have got that done by now. They would have almost sort of outbid United and said, okay, we're prepared to pay the extra 10 million you're not prepared to pay, and we get the deal over the line. And perhaps it's not the kind of perfect deal that we want to do, but equally we just want to get the player in the building and we move on. Spurs, for various reasons, which I think are, some of which are very legitimate, they don't have that kind of free-wheeling funding that other clubs have. They have to be a bit more careful, and so it's a bit more of a waiting game.
With someone like Eze, he's got a reported release clause of 68 million. It feels like Spurs and Eze have been flirting with each other for the last couple of years. Paul O'Keefe mentioned that they're not so stringent on that 60 million upfront anymore. Could be over the course of 3-year payment, 20 million a year. Surely that's something Spurs should be looking to get done.
Yeah, that has always been an issue with Eze. Palace have always wanted the kind of the money all up front. It's not information I have about the splits in the clause. Breaking the payments down, because that has been, I think, a hurdle in the past. So if that was something that was going to change this summer, then perhaps that would allow Spurs to feel like the deal was more sustainable, more financeable for them. I personally think Eze is a great player. I think he would be such a great signing for Tottenham, not just for the way he is as a player, but I think as a character. He's the kind of player I think Spurs fans would love to get behind. And I mean, we've seen him, against Spurs. He's played some of his best matches against Tottenham, and the goals he scored and the way he's played in those games. It's just obvious to see what a player he can be. Not just now, but in the next few years. So, I mean, if it was me, it's not my money, but he would be my pick. I think he would bring so much to Spurs in so many different ways.
Yeah, going back to Mbeumo, you were saying how we've heard about Tottenham's interest. The current kind of reports surrounding that deal is that he prefers to move to Man United, but Tottenham are kind of registering their interest in case that move falters. But there have been some other reports suggesting it's not a foregone conclusion if Tottenham really are serious putting their hat in the ring that he would choose United with Frank now being at Tottenham. Is there anything you've heard about that deal that could maybe sway Mbeumo to come into Tottenham, you think?
Well, I think sometimes these things are presented in black and white, and actually, there are shades of grey in between. I think it's possible for Mbeumo's first choice to have been Manchester United, but things change, and Thomas Frank being appointed at Tottenham is obviously a big change, and it doesn't mean that suddenly he decides that Tottenham is his first choice or Manchester United is his first choice. But I think there are various factors here, in terms of which club has an offer accepted, of course, but also, you talk to the coaches about roles, you talk to the club about, where they see you, and depending on the length of the contract, all these different factors that come into it. I don't think Spurs, are out of the race if they decide to match Brentford's asking price. But I still think, we think that Manchester United are still kind of in the driving seat on that deal.
What's become evident once again is the numbers going into the Champions League next season. Only one club-trained player really on the roster in Brandon Austin, and they are looking, if you believe what's going on in the press, to bring in someone like the likes of Dennis Serkin, Kyle Walker-Peters. Is that because there has to be some moving parts, doesn't there, if the Spurs want to make significant movement in the business, in the transfer market, because we're just oversubscribed in terms of players and undersubscribed in terms of club-trained players. So do you think Dennis Serkin or Kyle Walker-Peters are, real viable, realistic options this summer?
Well, they need to. I mean, Kyle Walker-Peters would be interesting given they sort of had him in the building and let him go. And he's sort of been available for the last year or two, to be honest, and they haven't gone for him. So, I mean, I think there's always this policy at Spurs where there's almost two currents going on at the same time. They'll sort of act in the market for the present manager and sign players who are, let's say more kind of premium players, more expensive players. And then they will also sign, club signings, players who are younger, more affordable, ideally sort of, qualify as club trained, and all these things can happen sort of concurrently. And I think for what it's worth, I think that's quite smart. If you sort of throw all your eggs into one basket, and you sign all the players that Antonio Conte wants, for example, then fine, you can commit to that manager. But ultimately, if that manager then leaves a year later and that hasn't worked out, then you've got a lot of players, who are plus 29, plus 30 years of age on big salaries, and you've got to shift them every single time. So, and we know that, a lot of the younger players that Spurs have signed historically have actually been their better signings, right? I mean, the ones who have been younger, hungrier perhaps, on smaller wages initially, that's actually been the market where Spurs have been pretty successful. Whereas the ones where they've, the more expensive ones, let's say Ndombele and Lo Celso, even going back historically, Postiga, Rebro, if you like, there are lots of players where they've sort of, relatively in terms of the markets, spent big money in Spurs terms that haven't really come off, and so I think, it makes sense for them to sort of have this dual policy almost where they sign players for the now, but also players for the future as well. And I think that will 100% be on their agenda in this window as well. And I think when we talk about depth, I think that's where they will look to bring in some depth, by bringing in, 2 or 3 more youngsters. We know that Thomas Frank, for example, he has, a good knowledge and a good eye for the Scandinavian market. And I wouldn't be surprised to see them bring in at least one player from over there.
So you're not necessarily convinced of the reports that are looking at Serkin or Walker-Peters, because obviously these aren't players who fans, I guess, would say they're players that take you to the next level, but other fans would say they're a bit of a necessity because, as my brother was saying, these club trade numbers are so low. if we don't make a signing there, we risk going to the season really without a backup fullback, really, unless you're looking to sign one. But then all of a sudden, I think our squad numbers are going to be limited to 21, I think, in the Champions League, or 22, sorry, if we don't make a club train signing. So it's either we make one, or we have to kind of sign a backup fullback, and we won't have an option there. And we won't have an option down the line to another place in the squad.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, last year you might not, you'll remember better than me, but what was the beginning of the season? I think they suddenly had like some 18 senior players available.
We had to leave Spence out, didn't we, at the beginning?
Italy, Spencer, and and that all contributed to the problems they had. That was always what I felt about the Postecoglou problem, as it were, was the kind of combination of the demanding style of play, which definitely contributed, in my opinion, to the number of injuries. But in isolation, that might have been okay if they'd had a squad that was able to absorb it. But the combination of having a light squad and also a manager with a demanding style of play physically was obviously a disaster, and they probably should have learned that after season one. But they didn't, and actually season two was in the end even worse.
I know Johan Lang likes to keep a tight lid on things behind the scenes, but you heard of anything? He's not like Don Paratici, who likes to go for 10 players at the same time and they're all playing out in the press in front of our eyes. But have you heard any other names that maybe we haven't spoken about today that Spurs are potentially looking at?
Well, those two, I mean, you mentioned Paratici and Lang, but I mean, they both have, obviously an active role in Tottenham's kind of transfer dealings at the moment in slightly different ways. I think, we know Lang is very, very good in terms of the data, in terms of the youth market. And actually, I think, we look at, since he came in the last couple of years, like his record has been pretty good. Like, I think Tottenham's record in the market in the last year or two, you can say that they haven't done enough, but I think actually what they have done, you look at the players they brought in for Ange, and I think most of them have been hits, two or three, still to be seen and to be proven. We think about Archie Gray, for example, Bergvall even, but I mean, Bergvall already has been a huge hit. But I think overall, he's done a pretty good job so far, and we wait to see what Paratici's role will be officially. We know he's still working kind of in a consultancy role for Spurs. His ban ends middle of July. Very possible that he comes back in, although how that then works with Lange, there might have to be a slight sort of tweaking of roles perhaps, or do they keep him on and they kind of just the consultancy role he has now for a while longer if it kind of works? That could also be possible. In terms of players, I mean, as I say, I think the lull right now, I think is because they're sort of waiting. We're in that situation. It's a slightly boring answer for you, but we're in that situation where they are weighing up sort of 3 or 4 targets in the positions where they want, and some of those targets are in the kind of in the public domain, in the media right now, and others not so much. But I think if you think about those 4 positions, Mbeumo, Semenyo, Eze, you're thinking about players that Spurs probably should be considering, and I think they're going to be looking at those 3 or 4 players. They'll find out what the fees are going to be. They'll find out if the players are interested in coming to Tottenham. And then, they make their move slightly later down the line rather than now, But I think it'll be an interesting window for Tottenham. I think they'll come out at the end of the summer with some interesting signings. And I have to say, I don't know what you guys think, but I personally don't think they need a revolution this summer. I think they need some evolution, and I think it's important they don't overreact, to finishing 17th. And that sounds a bit strange perhaps, but I actually think they've got a talented squad there, and I think a new manager coming in is actually in quite a nice position, because I think in terms of expectations, people aren't expecting, they don't have to improve on 4th place or 3rd place next season. 17th gives them a lot of margin for improvement. And I think Thomas Frank will look at the squad and think he's actually got a lot of players there with a lot of upside, a lot of players who are 6 or 7 out of 10s at the moment, who he can develop and make into really good players, and that's not just the young ones. I think, there are other ones in the squad who I think he'll think I could, someone like Udogi, Pedro Porro, these kind of guys who are playing well and have had good seasons for Tottenham, but I think they can go to another level. I think there are 3 or 4 or 5 players like that in that squad where he'll look at them and think, you look at his record of what he did at Brentford with lesser talented players. I think, I think this is a squad that just needs two or three good signings for the lineup, two or three good signings for squad depth, and I think Spurs can be right back in the mix.